All right, welcome back to this video. This is an introduction to biases, and I decided to start with the question, are you biased? The short answer is yes, and that is completely normal. The reason why is because I always want to start with a reminder that we all are biased, and that is completely normal. Now, before we go with any depth or we try to go any deeper with biases, I like to start with definitions because unless we have an understanding of what biases are and what biases are not, we have a common understanding. We have the same concepts of what biases are. We probably are going to misunderstand each other. So I'm going to start by giving you and I'm sorry to be this person, but I'm just going to give you just a quick definition. According to the Merriam-Webster, biases is an inclination of temperament or outlook, especially a personal and sometimes unreasoned judgment prejudice. So if I ask you about biases, you probably have two ideas in your mind. One could be one-sided mindset or one-sided person, and the other one is a prejudiced person, right? But there's also a lesser known definition of a bias, and that is a line diagonal to the grain of a fabric. Now, what is that? What does that mean exactly? Well, if you remember, in the first video, I showed you a polo and I put a tape on it, and the tape was pointing upwards. And the reason is because if you take any piece of clothing, clothes are made either by building upwards or downwards, depending on how you look at it. So any line diagonal to that grain of fabric, meaning the way that the piece of clothing was built, any line diagonal to that is also called bias. Now, where does that word come from? But actually, this is not an English word. It comes from the French term biais, and I apologize because I do not speak French, and that means slant, slope, and oblique. And that is actually closer to the origin of the word, which we will see in a second. But I want you to start thinking about that idea of deviation or oblique rather than already on one side. Now, it turns out that the true origin of the word comes from the game of bowls. And I didn't mean bowling, it's just bowls. So, bowls is a popular game among older people in Europe. And I don't mean to be disrespectful, it's just that I actually happen to like it. But I think that is a very common game practiced by older people. And the idea of the game is that you have a ball of reference that is thrown in the middle of a field, and then each individual player, they have their own balls that then they have to throw, and whomever gets closest to that ball of reference wins the game. Now, what is bias in that context? Well, it turns out that, like in any other game, people used to cheat, and the way that they used to cheat in this game is by making special balls that were heavier on one side, and then they will offer those balls to other people, and then obviously when those people were to throw the ball, instead of going straight, they will start deviating and going towards one side, getting farther from the objective, right? So, as I said before, the most common definition or the most common idea I think that people have when talking about bias is that idea of one-sided or one-side mindset. But I think it's closer to define that as a deviation from, which we will complete in a second with the entire definition. And I want you to start thinking about that deviation from more than already on one side, because that's closer again to the real meaning of the word. Again, have you been accused of being biased, or have you accused someone else of being biased? Probably the answer is yes, because it's very common. The problem comes when someone misuses a term, and then there are common misunderstandings about the uses of the terms bias, and especially bias and cognitive bias, and they use it as a substitute from one another. So bias is just that generic term that I just gave you that includes, the movement of the ball when you throw it and deviates from to the side, and that includes also the any line diagonal to the piece of fabric. But cognitive bias is actually a more precise term, and in fact, it's a systematic pattern of deviation from norm or rationality in judgment. Again, that idea of deviation from, and probably when you think about systematic pattern, you're triggered by that, and you're thinking, well, can a person be biased that one time? Yes and no. You can actually exhibit that behavior that time, but everything that led to you to think that way or to say those things or to behave in a way that is perceived as bias obviously shows that there is a pattern leading to that. It doesn't just appear out of nowhere. So again, systematic pattern of deviation from norm or rationality in judgment. So again, when someone accuses you of being biased or you accuse someone, what you mean to say is that that person exhibits cognitive biases, right? There's also a second misunderstanding is that is the confusion between the terms cognitive bias and confirmation bias. Like for example, when someone says to you, oh, you're watching too much MSNBC or you're watching too much Fox News, that is actually cognitive bias known as confirmation bias. And I said it that way because yes, it's a type of cognitive bias, but it's not cognitive bias. It's just one type of cognitive bias. So we will see confirmation bias in the future in a different video, but right now it's sufficient for me to just say that it's when a person selects information that confirms a preconceived idea, filtering out those that information or pieces of information that actually does not prove those points. I'm going to phrase it that again because I didn't say that proves them wrong. I just said that does not prove. So basically, you filter out everything that is not proving your point. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're discarding only the things that disprove you. You might actually consider certain things or not consider certain things based on the idea of proving your point or preconceived ideas of not proving your preconceived idea. So since you're trying to look for things that confirm your preconceived ideas, that is confirmation bias. And again, that is just one type of bias that we will talk about later on in different videos. Now, so you probably are asking yourself, why are we biased? What is the reason why we basically deviate from logic and sometimes we are not even aware of that? Well, the idea is that our species had to adapt to very difficult situations. So our ancestors couldn't afford to just learn everything from scratch all the time. So we needed to find a system that could at least help us identify things that were dangerous for us from things that were good for us and increases our chances to survive. And in fact, I'm going to make that distinction because I want to put that idea out there already that unfortunately our brain is more brain wired to actually detect and get away from things that are dangerous to us than it is to increase our survival. And that is a faulty mechanism. And yes, this mechanism is not perfect, but it's a mechanism. So again, a mechanism that can help you detect where to find food, what are the type of berries that you should be touching, and what are the type of berries that you should not be touching. Look for potential dangerous animals, etc. So as you see, it's an adaptive way of for us to learn. In this case, for our ancestors to learn. Now, keep in mind that all of that took thousands and thousands of years to develop, and it's very difficult for us to just get rid of that since again it took such a long time for us to evolve in a way in which we could identify those potential dangers and things that were good for us. Now that is just the basic explanation, but what is exactly what happens in our brain? Well, it turns out I'm going to show you from the side. Let's pretend that this is your brain. This will represent the base of your brain. This will represent your front of the brain. This will represent the top, and this will represent the back of your brain. So on the bottom and the base, I'm going to actually make it a little more precise. This would represent the amygdala. And what is the amygdala? The amygdala is just a nucleus. It's a conglomerate of a group of neurons that form, again, a nucleus called the amygdala that is activated when we experience something traumatic. So basically, the whole purpose or the sole purpose of the amygdala is to help you get out of dangerous situations. So think about your heart rate going up, your blood pumping towards your legs so you can run faster. Everything starts with the amygdala. And why is that important? Because let's say that with the example that I gave you before, that now you have someone in your family touching a berry, eating it, and that person drops it. It's he or she, it could be your son, daughter, whomever. So obviously that would be a traumatic experience. Your amygdala would be activated. You would feel that you are yourself in danger. And then the second thing happens with how you react. And how you would react will depend, among other things, from your prior experiences with the same or similar situations. So let's say that this is the first time that you have ever experienced something like that. Someone, again, let's say that it was your son, ate a berry and then immediately died. And this is the first time that that happened. This is the first time that you have seen anybody eating that specific type of berry. So now your amygdala is not only going to activate all of these processes and try to look for ways to escape that, because now you might think that it's not only the berry, it might be the trees, but also it will record that experience, traumatic experience, and later on in the future, if you encounter something like that, you encounter a similar tree, a similar fruit, you will avoid that as much as you can. But what if you had a prior experience or prior experiences and nothing has happened? What if this is like the 20th time that you have eaten yourself those berries? You just were eating the berries before, nothing happened to you. That just happened to affect your son and the son died. Then you probably are going to compare that with your prior experiences. Now, I talk about the amygdala, again, that portion that is on the base and the inside of your brain. On the front, we have the prefrontal cortex, and that is like the supercomputer of your brain. And basically, what it does is not only to compute all of the information that we have, but also to elaborate and give responses. So in this case, your amygdala will be activated the same way as if this was the first time that you have encountered. But if you already have experiences in the past with those berries, then your prefrontal cortex will compare with the prior experiences. You would look for the way that you felt. You look for things that happened at that time. If you felt weird, if you feel okay, and will elaborate a response. And that response might be that everything was fine, and then you'll need to look for a different response against what happened. Maybe my son is sick for something else, and now I need to be worried about something else that might be getting to some other member of my family, etc. But as you see, the same event, I mean, the event hasn't changed. It's the same event. The person ate a berry and dropped dead. Now, my responses against that are completely different depending on what are the prior experiences that I have in the past. So again, that idea of the amygdala interacting with the prefrontal cortex. And as you can see, this is kind of a loophole, a loop. Why? Because the amygdala will help me understand a little bit better from an emotional point of view. What do I mean by that? Like if I had a prior experience that was traumatic, as I said before, then I will try to avoid that immediately, and that's it. In this case, the amygdala will be the protagonist of that event. But if nothing had happened in the past, I didn't record that as a traumatic event, then if I see or encounter that in the future, I might not feel anything at all. I would just even eat the berries and that's it. So why did I say that that is a loop? Because the way that we perceive things is influenced by our prior experiences that now influences the things that we're going to perceive in the future. And as you can see, that is a loop, right? So again, the only thing that I wanted you to remember from here is the interaction between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. And keep in mind that most of what I just described actually happens unconsciously, meaning we don't even have an awareness of that, except obviously for the prefrontal cortex that allow us to compare. We can be aware of that, but that activation of the amygdala happens without us being conscious of aware of that. Meaning the amygdala happens first, and the prefrontal cortex happens a little bit later. Now, I discussed prior to that idea of having a system that allow us to identify what things are bad for us and what things are good for us. And I decided to title this is all about heuristics because that's the name of that system. And heuristics actually come from the Greek word eurisko, and that actually means I discover. Keep in mind that it didn't say to discover, I didn't say discover, I just say literally I discover, because the I, meaning the person, is also important because it informs you that you're part creator of that reality. And in fact, and I'm sorry to do this again, I'm going to find heuristics so you can understand more of what I mean. Heuristics is any approach to problem solving or self discovery that employs a practical method that is not guaranteed to be optimal, perfect, or rational, but is sufficient for reaching an immediate short term goal or approximation. I'm going to break it down because I know that this is very complicated. Now, it's any approach to problem solving, meaning you, the person, has encountered a problem. It could be the barriers, and now you need to figure out what happened. But it could be anything else. It could be an argument that you have with someone and trying to figure out what's happening with that person. Now, again, any approach to problem solving or self discovery that employs a practical method, meaning you're starting to compare with experience that you have had in the past, and you're trying to come up with an answer that is not guaranteed to be optimal, meaning that answer doesn't have to be optimal, doesn't have to be perfect, doesn't even have to be rational. It could be an irrational thought, but is sufficient for reaching an immediate short-term goal or approximation. As I said before, our heuristics, well, I didn't name it back then, but as I said before, we needed a system that helped us understand our world, mostly our environment. And we're so brainwired, as I said before as well, to look for things that are potentially dangerous for us, that we're hardwired again to pay attention to those, even at the cost of how we survive. Now, that triggers the need of a quick response, meaning I have to come up with an answer. I have to come up now. So that quickness makes sometimes for a lot of mistakes, and that is one of the reasons why we have a lot of the problems. However, the system is a system that allows us to survive. So you cannot have it both ways. You cannot ask the system to be perfect, because the system was not created to be perfect. The system was created to give quick answers. And now, talking about quickness and not quickness, we're going to see later on how those systems actually can be subdivided in two, and two systems are different or work at different speeds. But before we go there, one of the main problems with heuristics is that since I have a system and I rely on that system so much, because everything that you can imagine in your life that needs a response is done through heuristics. So since I rely on that system, and that system seems to be working for me most of the time, well, that depends on how you perceive yourself. I might have to that misunderstanding or confusion between the heuristics and truth. I might perceive that since I already have the system and that system gave me an answer, that answer must be truth. And I'm going to give you probably a better example by saying you probably have encountered someone saying, what are you talking about? How is that possible that you concluded that if for me, the facts speak louder? Now, that happens when, for example, you encounter someone who disagrees with you in something that seems to be so obvious for that person. Or you yourself actually might end up being at the end of that, meaning you might be the person who disagrees with the person and now thinks, how is it possible that you reach a conclusion if for me it's so evident? I have the data, I have the facts. Sometimes, especially when people are caught up with that idea of, well, facts over everything else, what they mean to say is that they have an interpretation of the facts that makes them think that what they perceive is true. But that is, again, just a faulty mechanism. And that faulty mechanism comes from heuristics. And it's created because of the false sense of security that we have that heuristics and truth are the same thing. Remember, heuristics is just a system that is going to guarantee to have an answer, but it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be good for you. It doesn't even have to be rational. It just has to guarantee to give you an answer. I also have a second definition for heuristics. Maybe this is a little bit easier, so that's why I'm going to repeat it in the future. Heuristics is just the best way we can approach a problem with the tools that we have. Meaning, if I have a problem, if I have encountered a problem and I have the right tools, I might be able to give a proper answer. And I say might, because I might even give bad answers. But if I don't have the tools, probably I'm not going to reach a good answer. I'm probably going to give an answer that is inadequate for what I'm trying to look for, right? So again, it's the best way we can approach a problem with the tools that we have. Now, as I said before, the problem with this is that we tend to equate our heuristics with logic and truth. As I said before, a typical person who would say to you, you're being illogical, you're being irrational because I can see this and it's clear. Well, that could be true, that could be clear, and it could be logical, and it could be the only explanation, but could also be that that person's interpretation is so ingrained in that person's brain that it's difficult for that person to interpret any other way what just happened. So again, conclusion about this is don't confuse truth with heuristics. Now, as I said before, we're talking about different speeds, and we're talking about having to work and having to come up with an answer. So Professor Daniel Kahneman, and he's a professor of economics, and psychology, came up with a great concept. And by the way, Daniel Kahneman, you're going to hear me talk about him because among the people who study biases, included, is considered kind of like the father of the biases because he created several books. He has written several books in which most of the biases and even anti-biases trainings have been based on. So he actually come up with this idea of system one and system two. What is that? So system one is a fast process. So imagine that you need to come up with an answer against a problem. And that problem could be someone asking you about what is the color of your car, what is the name of your daughter, the name of your son. So obviously for all of those things, you don't require a lot of brain power. The information is easily accessible to you. In that case, you would be using what Daniel Kahneman defined as system one, which again is a fast process. It is an automatic response. It doesn't require a lot of effort. However, if I ask you how much is 37 times 4 plus 47, you probably will have a tougher time than if I ask you about your car or the color of your car, because then you would have to elaborate the answer by thinking about it, engaging different portions of your brain. So for that system, again, a system that is slower, he defined as a system two. Again, it's a slow process. It requires a little bit more brain power. And the perfect example again is a math problem. However, I want to clarify, not all math problem and not all people will be using system two. Why? What if you are one of these math genius, one of these human calculators, and I gave you the same problem that I just gave you before? Maybe you're going to respond as quickly as if I ask you about the color of your car, because that is, again, easily accessible to you. So in that case, you would be using the system one rather than the system two. But for most of us, probably that math problem will be part of the system two. Now, there are several confusions about system one and system two. The first one is most people tend to believe, or most people tend to, when they first hear about system one and system two, is that since system one is fast, they tend to think, well, system one probably is going to be less reliable. And system two, since requires more time and it requires more brain power in different portions of the brain, probably is more trustworthy. And that is a bias in itself because there's no guarantee that the system one or system two, the system two is going to give you a great answer, meaning just because you took 5 minutes to solve a math problem, that doesn't guarantee that you're going to come up with the right answer. And just because it took me 0.5 seconds to give you an answer, that doesn't mean that is a bad answer. Why? Because if you're asking me about the color of my car, obviously that answer is right here. It's because I see it every day, because I drive it every day. So obviously that information is going to be easily accessible to me. Therefore, I'm going to give you a much better answer, even if it's quicker. So again, don't confuse the speed with veracity and truth. And also, I also want to remind people that heuristics is not system one. Just because heuristics is a system, again, the best way we can approach a problem with the tools that we have, and I suggested that it's designed to give you a quick answer, that doesn't mean that is system one. Heuristics would be like the general term, is again a system that guarantees to have an answer. Well, system one and system two are the processes for which you will have an answer. So heuristics has an influence over both systems, again, system one and system two. So I want to remind that definition again of the best way we can approach a problem with the tools that we have. Now, there's also one idea that I wanted to talk about in this introduction to biases that I think is crucial. And that has to do with how aware are you, or how aware are we of our own limitations. And there's this concept about minimum knowledge to have an understanding of things. Now, a lot of people are unfortunately unaware of how little they know about subjects that they are passionate about or even have strong opinions about. And everything comes from that idea that I discussed in the beginning, from a misunderstanding between heuristics and logic and truth. Again, that idea that since I have a system, since I have a system that guarantees me to give me an answer, since I've used that system, and especially if I use the system two, in which I have taken the effort to read, to compare with other experiences from the past, and I reach a conclusion, that that conclusion must be true. And in fact, there's a lot of assumptions. But if to that you add that idea that in order for you to understand anything, you need to have a minimum requirement understanding of that problem, then you're adding an extra layer. And it's not only your heuristics tricking you into thinking that the conclusions that you have are true and they must be true, not that the system too is requiring more effort, and therefore, since you took more effort, that you might be true. It's also that you're not even aware that there are maybe many things, again, the tools that we were discussing before, that you don't have. You don't have experience in certain things, therefore, you might not even understand, or even you could not even start understanding a problem. Therefore, there's a gap in knowledge that you need to cover. Now, those confusions between, as I said before, heuristics and truth is the basis for many biases, but also not recognizing that there's a gap in knowledge that you might not have. It's also the basis for many biases, that you're going to see or encounter in the future. Now, taking that to an extreme, meaning taking that idea of a person who is not aware, self-aware of their own knowledge, if you take that into extreme, that is a type of bias that you will know as, we will see in the future, is known as Dunning-Kruger effect. And basically, I'm going to give you an example because this is going to be a little bit easier to understand. If I give you the example, imagine that someone at your job, and this is probably something that has happened to you, has to complete a form describing their experience in the job and also how well they have done and performed in certain tasks. And they decided to grade everything like perfect, excellent, 10 out of 10. And then now you look at the person, you have been working with that person, and you and your coworkers think of that person that he or she is not capable of doing certain tasks. And now all of a sudden you're seeing that this person seems to be unaware of that, but seems to be unaware in a point that they think that they're doing so much better than they truly are. So that is an example of Dunning-Kruger effect. So granted, yes, you might be biased towards that person, and maybe that person does better than you think, but there are certain things that are objectively true. There are certain things that you could measure perfectly. And for those things, when someone has that misunderstanding or that misalignment, between reality and how they perceive themselves as knowing certain subjects, that gap or that misalignment between reality again and how they perceive things is the Dunning-Kruger effect. Now, next, I will be discussing confirmation bias. And again, confirmation bias being that bias for which a person tends to filter out everything that does not prove a preconceived idea, and instead he or she will focus on things that confirm those preconceived ideas. So this last portion has to do with how you relate with other people. So far, what I have discussed before was focused on you, meaning I went from that very definition of what biases are and what biases are not, and then we move quickly as of how our biases produce, what happens in your brain from a neuroscience point of view. Then I gave you a couple of psychology terms like heuristics and system one and system two, but all of that has to do with you, with the individual. Now we're going to talk about how you relate to other people and also with other information, but mostly with other people. And I decided to title this Finding Your Tribe. Now, keep in mind that there's nothing bad about that. I want to stop and just focus on that first. There's nothing bad about trying to find people who are like minded, people who think like you, similar like you. There's nothing wrong about that. In fact, I would argue that either extreme is bad. Neither is good to have an extreme point of view in which you're looking for people who are always contrary to your point of view, which will definitely cause a detriment in your self perception. You will doubt on yourself, you will be more insecure. But it's also not good to go to the other extreme in which you only relate to people who are like minded, people who think talk like you, see the same things like you. So there's always a danger in only relating yourself with people who, again, are like you and think like you. And that is the beginning of confirmation bias, which will be the next video. Now, before I leave you, I hope that this is useful. Thank you so much for watching. But remember one thing, this is not a tool for you to shame anybody. This is not a tool for you to shame yourself or to feel bad about yourself. Hopefully, it's clear from the very beginning that A, we are all biased, and then that's completely normal. And B, that because we are all biased, we have to have a better understanding of that and not quickly judge other people. So again, as I said before, I hope that this is useful to you. I hope to see you in the next video in which I will be discussing confirmation bias. Thank you so much, and I see you again in the next video.